Tonight's Northeast Housing Strategies Oversight meeting. I'm going to ask everybody to please cease your private conversations, and we're going to begin our meeting. So I'm Bishop Stephen Holt, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight. And again, we apologize for the excessive delay in our beginning, but we're starting now. Let me remind you that this is a meeting that's open to the public, but it's not a public forum. And therefore, if you want to share, you need to sign your name in, and you will have an opportunity after we get through the conversation around the topics of the night. You'll have an opportunity to speak to what is on the agenda tonight. We've got a pretty full agenda and pretty significant things I think we need to cover. So I'm looking forward to our time. Welcome. Thank you for your time in coming. If you will look around the room, you will also notice that there are some kind of poster boards describing the area of focus and also how the dollars that we are being allocated to be addressed. So again, I appreciate your time and your availability for this evening. If you do want to share, and we'd love to hear from you, it is in relationship to the things that are on the agenda. You will have to sign your name in, and then at the end of the presentation, you will have some moments to interact. We're going to begin by talking about our preference policy, and we have some presenters to talk to us about that. If you will identify yourselves, and then it's in your hands.
I'm Martha Calhoun. I'm Public Information Officer with the Portland Housing Bureau.
Matthew Schaubold, the Equity and Policy Manager with the Housing Bureau.
We'll start tonight by discussing the first application round for the preference policy. It closed on May 13th. It was our kind of first rollout of the policy, and it was for home ownership program openings funded through the Northeast Neighborhood Housing Strategy. So as I mentioned, it just recently closed, and as we sort through the applicant information, we will learn more about the results of our marketing and outreach efforts. But this evening, I am just here to summarize for you what those efforts to reach displaced households looked like and give you some initial findings that we've compiled so far. Can you click? So we began by setting some broad overarching goals for marketing and outreach. We wanted to, first of all, ensure that our marketing and outreach efforts had broad geographic reach, modeled after what we believe we understand about displacement trends and the resulting demographic shifts, both within Portland and then outside of Portland into the broader metro area, namely into Vancouver and Camas, Hillsborough, Gresham, Beaverton, and Troutdale. Part of this reach was accomplished through paid advertising, primarily in print media outlets across those geographic areas. But the crux of the strategy was really in fostering and formalizing some broad community-based partnerships with community-serving organizations that could serve as liaisons and sort of trusted ambassadors to the communities and clients that they already serve. And then finally, we set a goal also to create inclusive marketing and directly engage in the community for the purpose of informing and educating potentially eligible households about this homeownership opportunity. So one of the key components of this outreach strategy is what we're calling designated application sites. From the beginning, my colleague Cupid Alexander, who led this implementation for the Bureau, really back-engineered this process with the highest barrier applicants in mind. And so to increase access and support for high barrier applicants, we partnered with 11 organizations across the Portland metro area to serve as designated application sites, where applicants could get more information, access printed application materials, translation services, reasonable accommodation requests, turn in their applications, get in-person assistance, and in some cases use computers to access the online application. These application sites included a number of existing Housing Bureau community partners such as Proud Ground, both offices of the Portland Housing Center, including their Beaverton office, PCRI and Hacienda. They also included public library sites, including Midland on Southeast 122nd and also the Troutdale Library. And the Multnomah County Library System represented a new partnership for PHB, and it turned out to actually be a really natural fit for this kind of effort and really served to help us expand our reach. So prior to the release of the application in mid-April, PHB staff provided on-site training to the staff at each one of these sites so that they would have a clear understanding of the goals so that they could be prepared to answer questions, provide applicant support as staff capacity allowed, access translation services, and they were also trained in assisting applicants in how to maximize their points, which included trying a combination of maybe 4 or 6 different addresses to see which would get them the highest point value on their application. They all of the 11 application sites agreed to partner with us on a voluntary basis out of kind of a shared commitment and understanding of the importance of doing something like this. So then beyond the designated application sites, we did outreach more broadly to about 120 community-based organizations that were kind of natural community touch points. These included community centers, 18 Northeast Portland church congregations, public schools and Sun schools, boys and girls clubs, and local businesses such as barbershops. And again, one of the aims was broad geographic reach, high visibility, and also a broad reach in terms of communities served. So we provided them with information and materials, which we requested that they distribute and have on hand. This map here just provides kind of a visual overview of what that outreach looked like, so this represents everyone that we contacted in the process in some sort of way, whether that, and they participated in the process in some sort of way, whether that meant they posted a flyer in their place of business or all the way to, they served as a designated application site. So again, just to recap, PHB conducted outreach to 120 community-based organizations and actively collaborated with about 70. Partnerships and engagement included 42 community centers, including 18 public libraries, 5 school districts, as well as Sun schools and the Kairos PDX program. Marketing materials were translated into 3 different languages other than English. That includes Spanish, Vietnamese, and Russian. We also did culturally specific outreach through various organizations and community-based media. We also did outreach to 24 income-specific and or culturally specific nonprofits. So then here is what that outreach looks like, broken out by type of organization and then their respective areas of focus or population served. So about 33% of these organizations were nonprofits, 6% media outlets, 6% schools, 11% local businesses, and then community centers were 32% and then 12% other. And then the vast majority were kind of broken out between income-specific organizations and culturally specific organizations, and then also organizations that had a real geographic tie, as well as some language-specific organizations. So then we also, throughout the process, had a dedicated helpline and email that were featured on all of our marketing materials. We hired a community aide to staff both. And of the inquiries received, over 400 applicants received helpline support from PHB's community specialist. 100% of helpline callers were called back within 24 hours. I actually want to note a small correction on that bullet point. That was not limited to just callers. It also included inquiries that came in through the email. So 100% of inquiries got a response within 24 hours. Under 1% of callers reported that they were displeased with the application. Again, small correction to this bullet, that is not limited to callers either. That also includes respondents to the voluntary applicant survey that we sent out or gave out with applications. And 99 hours of on-site applicant support were provided by PHB staff. So PHB staff were present at least one of the sites, providing on-site support for every day of the open application round. And then digital marketing and print marketing reached a record number of views. I won't read the whole slide in the interest of time, but I think one of the most remarkable pieces of information from this slide is that our website, where we created a page that was sort of a centralized hub for all of the resources and information about the preference policy application process, averaged nearly 1,000 visitors a day during the application window alone. So that's a substantial increase over baseline by about 5-fold. So we marketed the application round for 42 days. It began about a month before the application window actually opened. The application was available to view in print and online for 2 weeks prior to the application round opening so that people could reach out with questions or request reasonable accommodations. And then this slide shows that we received a little over 1,100 applications between May 2nd and May 13th. As we have, since this slide was created, we have had a little more opportunity to process some of the applications, and after removing duplicates and things, that number is slightly lower, but sort of just to give you some broad strokes, we received over 1,000 applications, the vast majority of which came in through the online application. And then we have a map that did not make it into this presentation, but essentially, and we can provide it online following this meeting, but essentially we mapped the geographic distribution of the applicants who submitted application to us to see where they were actually coming from. And the vast majority were from within Portland, followed at over 770, with nearly 90 from Gresham, 30 from Vancouver, more than 50 that we've categorized as other suburban, and then 9 from other places in Oregon, and 5 from other states. In terms of next steps, we are in the midst of an internal process to process the applications, calculate the preference points, randomize the applications. We'll then select and notify applicants, verify selected applicants' information, and we expect to have households ready to begin working with the homeownership partners by the fall. And in the June Oversight Committee, we expect to have, July. At the July meeting, we will have, we expect to have a more detailed applicant breakdown and a more complete picture of who actually applied through the process. Are there any questions?
We'll pause for a moment and ask if there's any questions from the Oversight Committee. Any questions for Martha in her presentation?
I'd like to make one comment about the origin of the applicants.
You need to push the button on your.
One thing, as a point of clarification, you mentioned the origin of the applicants. I think we've mapped that geographically as
Yes.
well. So for people that are interested in sort of a geographic distribution, we have a heat map that kind of shows where the folks are primarily from. Which will be of interest, I think, to the media,
Yeah,
perhaps to some of the
we'll
public.
post that with the materials
Yeah.
online after meeting.
Thank you. Matthew?
So, as Martha mentioned, we're still going through the process to look at the applications, and we're eliminating duplicate applications, and we're working to verify information. In particular, we're case managing each of the applicant households who claim that they were there was a family history of eminent domain or city condemnation action, because under the structure of the preference policy, they would have top priority. So at this point, we do have a preliminary analysis, which is up there on the screen, and you all have copies underneath your packets. And I'd like to invite up Victoria James, who is managing this particular part of the process, up to share some of our preliminary analysis. The one piece I would highlight as Victoria steps up is you'll notice that the total application count here is 1,052. And so this is even, I think Martha's presentation referenced around 1,100. So we're currently cleaning duplicate applications, and that number will change up or down. At this point, we're not sure, but where the final total will be. But we're about 2 weeks, almost 2 weeks into the application window closing. I think we're making pretty good progress. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Victoria.
Hello. So as Matt said, I'm the assistant program specialist working on the preference policy. Again, we're sort of still processing the data, but from what we have currently, you can see that there's a pretty good distribution of people falling into various point categories from 0 all the way to 6. I will note that the way that the preference policy works is that applicants can get between 0 and 6 points, and they can also say whether or not they had a house taken by the city, i.e. were a victim, I guess, of eminent domain. And for that reason, among other reasons such as the case management of the eminent domain, we did not include those statistics in the following presentation. All right, so as you will see perhaps a little bit more clearly on the handout, what we're looking at right here is the various race and ethnicity categories, as well as what number point value the applicant was eligible for. Again, with the race and ethnicity, applicants were allowed to elect multiple or decline giving us those. So when we talk about percentage of X ethnicity in the 6-point range, be wary that, again, these people might have elected that they were both Black and Slavic or XYZ other combination of race and ethnicities. Essentially what the chart is showing, though, is the race and ethnicities at the bottom, the percentage of people in this race and ethnicity in the 6-point category, and then, so that is the darkest bar, and the lighter bars are allowing you to compare across point ranges. So on this slide, the highlighted bar is people in the 6-point range, but you're also seeing, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, all the way to 0 points next to them in the slightly lighter bars. So for example, here, African immigrants are about 7 to 8% of all the 6-point households, right? Yeah. As you can kind of see, we got a majority of Black or African American applicants. And so they take up sort of the majority of applicants in each point range. But again, there's a pretty, even distribution of where people are falling within point ranges across all the race and ethnicities.
So more to come. We're still diving into the data. We didn't want to present too much of our analysis before we had our final list of applications, but I anticipate we'll be able to talk about age, race and ethnicity, application location, current location of applicants, any number of data points that were included in our application. And we're going to spend the next few weeks focused on processing the applications to a final form, but and given that we don't have a meeting in June, at the July meeting, we'll have a much more detailed analysis. But we're happy to answer any questions that you might have just based on our preliminary look at the application pool.
Thank you very much. It sounded like, or you mentioned that you haven't had a chance to scrub or process duplicate applications, so some were duplicates, is that my understanding?
I think that the 1050 number is a pretty solid number. We may see it go up or down one or two, particularly with our eminent domain calls, but about 1,000 applicants will be pretty solid for, and I'd remind folks, this is for 65 homeownership program slots, roughly 65 slots.
Yeah, it says a lot.
So just to clarify, there's the 1052 are just these 0 to 6 point households, and that number includes those that also are claiming the eminent domain preference, but that piece is just not verified.
No, that's correct. So we have about 250 applicants of the 1,052, I think is the number we're at, that claimed eminent domain. And the reason we didn't include it is because when we looked at the number and we looked at some of the context, we thought that number was high. We are finding that as we're case managing, so we're calling each of them or emailing each of them. We've got a team, Victoria's leading on that process. There's been a number of folks who kind of misunderstood the question as we've contacted them and asked them, could you please give us the location of, and more information. There's been some folks who have realized that when they first read the application that they were citing a bank foreclosure, either in the context of the 2008 financial crisis or before then, and the preference policy covers city condemnation and eminent domain, not bank foreclosures. I think we can work with those households, and we do need to figure something out with them. So I think you'll see the number 250 drop substantially. That said, we are seeing still seeing quite a few where it is in some form related to the Albina condemnation actions or the Memorial Coliseum or Manual Hospital. So we just didn't want to put the number out there because we're seeing so much that we need to case manage in the next few weeks.
Sure. And this might not be quite in your wheelhouse, but there's 1,000 people, there's 65 program slots. What's the, are there like time limits for people, the first 65 people who are chosen? Is there a time frame in which if they don't purchase a house, it's going to move to the next person? Or is there like a cycling through that you anticipate having?
There is a time frame, and I think that's probably more of a question for Andrea and Dana from our homeownership team. But they've been working with the partner organizations that are providing the services to identify a time frame that kind of balances the need for our provider partners to really help move folks into houses before the market gets any more intense than it already is in terms of cost, while also balancing that we don't want to have mortgage readiness be a criteria for getting a program slot. So I'm happy to get more information on those exact timelines. I just don't have it off the top of my head.
Thank you. Any other questions from the oversight?
Question, Matthew. May 18th, Secretary Julian Castro of HUD was part of a webinar that was actually for HUD office employees. They had a nationwide webinar about gentrification. And we got notice of it from the Community Preservation and Development staff in Seattle, and there's an online story called Rootedness, talking a little bit about North and Northeast Portland and the preference policy. And it particularly highlights the travails of one family that was highlighted, Helen and Nelson Murray, in the Willamette Week. But what's really quite interesting was that this came to me when I was in Denver last week, and I was meeting with some of my colleagues around the country, and San Francisco, for example, had asked HUD's approval for a neighborhood-specific preference policy for HUD 202 and 811 funding, and it had not been granted by HUD. In fact, they were receiving quite a lot of resistance from HUD. So it's great that the Secretary is elevating it, and perhaps this story can be distributed more broadly in the Northeast community. I'm not sure that it's small enough to really fit in our newsletter, so I think perhaps some web blast or something might be of some value. But it does demonstrate that HUD is, and I realize we didn't ask HUD for permission, and I explained that to San Francisco, because we're using tax increment financing from local sources, although we're still governed by the same legal strictures that San Francisco would be. But the fact that they're now using this as a national example of perhaps joined up thinking and how best to apply a principle of restorative justice to the community is a good thing, and we should make sure people know that this is really being held up as a national example.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
We're going to talk about we're going to move to the next item on our agenda, which is the fall NOFA decision. I'm actually going to ask Carl and Javier to join us at the table, please.
So while Carl...
Now, prior to
Yes,
your
sir.
beginning, if you would be sure that in your responses, anything that has an acronym associated with it, if you would make sure to explain the acronym, that would be most helpful for all those who are listening.
Like
Absolutely.
NOFA, Notice of Funding Availability.
Thank you very much, Bishop. I'm going to introduce the subject, and then I'll be joined by others. But just as a reminder, on October 27th, the Housing Bureau published a Notice of Fund Availability, what we call a NOFA. And because it included money, $61.6 million, plus 5 sites and 100 project-based rental assistance vouchers, sometimes called Section 8 vouchers, but more accurately known as housing choice vouchers. We referred to this as a super NOFA because it had all 3 elements: land, cash, and vouchers. We had a staggered application due date. We had a mandatory contractor participation fair, and we had a required developers workshop. And the response, quite frankly, was overwhelming because the Bureau had heretofore never offered such money. This was more than 3 times the last largest notice of fund availability. So we were definitely attracting interest from some legacy partners, some traditional partners, and some new partners. Of the requests that we tendered at the end of the process, we got 22 total requests for $91.2 million. And were they completely funded as proposed, would have produced 1,664 units. And that is citywide, not just in North and Northeast. There was a process that was deployed to internally evaluate and determine baseline eligibility, and then externally engage through community partners a means by which to rank these proposals and determine their relative merit. And Carl and Javier can speak to the specifics of that process. But At the end of the day, 8 projects were selected and 14 projects were not selected. And I think it's important to underscore that the 14 projects that were not selected, many of those were very worthy projects. This was not a case of them not being well-conceived or justified. It was really a question of how much money do we have to put into the community at one time. I think it's also important that you know that of that money, $5 million came from Multnomah County, together with one site on North Williams. The other 4 sites were owned by the City of Portland, but through 2 different bureaus, Bureau of Housing and the Portland Development Commission. So the county, the PDC, and the Housing Bureau were all joined together in this process, which made it especially complex, I think. So of the 8 funded projects that were selected, they would produce 569 new units, and they would preserve or rehabilitate 255 existing units for a total of 824. And one project was identified, proposed by Human Solutions in the Gateway Urban Renewal area, and they were neither denied nor selected, but they were given an exclusive right to negotiate further with the Housing Bureau. And that means to say that it was a good application for available funds, but it wasn't quite ready for prime time. They did propose 40 units using some $2.2 million, $2,250,000, adjoining a new community park in Gateway. And there were enough questions about the retail activity and the adjoining park that we needed to work with them on the details, which we've initiated and are currently doing. I think it's also important that you know that we did not allocate $10 million because of a particular project in the South Park blocks did not really merit the project proposal. And we can go into a little bit more detail about it, but it was a mixed-use building with housing, clinic space, office space, and a parking garage. And the benefit to housing was not as robust as we would have liked. And I think, moreover, it's important that you know that that site was in the same urban renewal area that the Joyce Hotel is in, and we had already initiated a negotiation with the owners of the Joyce Hotel to try to preserve that 1910 era building as the last weekly stay SRO in Portland. So we felt that it would be untoward and perhaps falling short of the community's expectations if we committed to a new project that wouldn't be built for 2 or 3 years. At the same time, we let an existing property fall through our hands. So that
Director, just real quickly.
Yes.
SRO.
Yes, thank you for calling me on that. That's single room occupancy. The Joyce is the last building in Portland that was rented out on a weekly stay basis. It was built in 1910, and it is in dire need of repair. And we had made a purchase offer during the NOFA process to try to preserve that building. So we've maintained that money in reserve, and if the Joyce Hotel owner is amenable, we may still come to some conclusion there. So I think it might be helpful first to respond to questions about the NOFA process itself, and then talk more particularly about North and Northeast Portland. Might you have any questions about sort of the selection process that I could respond to or that staff might respond to?
I think that much of the questions that we've identified have been communicated through our written process, and so I will defer for a moment to see if there's any specific questions from our Oversight Committee members, and if not, then I will then refer to the correspondence we've had via email. Okay. So.
I guess I'm not really clear on like what's coming next informationally.
Well, what I want to do is give you a life-to-date summary of what we've funded in North and Northeast pursuant to the $20 million, the TIF base, the TIF, and the TIF lift funds that are available. Because we have different accounts that we have custodial responsibility to manage.
Well, for us, the main concern would be what's going on as it relates to what's happening in the ICURA. So we want to talk about what's happening in the ICURA. We want to talk about the NOFA process related to the ICURA. We want to understand how decisions were made without communication with the Oversight Committee. We want an accounting for the process that helps us understand how we got to the point we are, and then what we're going to do to resolve going forward so we don't find ourselves at this point again. That's what we want to know.
So I can speak in terms of the process. We had, I'm sorry.
Let me, if you would be, to clarify what transpired, what the issues are that transpired, and then explain how we got there.
Sure.
That'd be great.
So Javier Mena, Assistant Director of the Housing Bureau. So I will definitely can talk about the process and how we got to decisions being made in terms of external evaluating committee members and the process itself. We had established a timeline as to how this NOFA, or as Kirk mentions, in Supernova would be flow, how it would flow. And once we understood how many proposals we needed to review, we began to look at how many external evaluating committees do we need. I made a mistake in terms of understanding that we may need only 3 external evaluating committees, and under those perceptions, we did the outreach and established the 3 evaluating committees, and the one that would be evaluating the Northeast proposals had a good mix of community and experts, finance experts in that group. Once I realized the mistake and needed to add another committee, and trying to stay within that timeline that we had established, I did not make the effort as much as I should have to ensure that there is representation in this 4th committee that was part of the community, whether it's through the oversight or whether it's through some other channel that's part of the community. We tried to make it a diverse group, but once again, there wasn't anybody specifically from the Northeast community. And I think that's where the mistake happened in terms of the selection process for the site on the King Parks. And I would say mistake in terms of not having it's somebody from the community be included on that panel. So we went through that process. Sure.
When you say King Parks, you're referring to, for those who don't know?
On the NOFA, we have the Portland Housing Bureau owns the parcel located on the corner of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. It's an empty parcel that we have owned for several years, and that we wanted to ensure that it gets developed as soon as possible. So based on those evaluations, we had internal staff evaluate proposals, and we had the external committees evaluate proposals based on those areas of expertise. And each of those committees scored the proposals and ranked the proposals. Let me rephrase that. They ranked the proposals, that scored them. And what staff did after those processes were completed is we brought both of those systems together and ranked them and identify within each of the funding categories which are the proposals that seem to be a consistent must-fund project. And we submitted a recommendation to Kurt and Commissioner Sussman in terms of those proposals, and then we went from there. So that was the process. And if there's questions about the process, I'll be happy to answer it.
So, if I'm understanding correctly, I think you said it twice, due to time constraints? Is that what I'm understanding?
based on the timeline that we had established, and in my mind, and this is where I think we can do better next time, is not be so strained in terms of those timelines, and in order to allow for the process to be more thoughtful, to expand that timeline. But in my mind, when I was going through this process, we have this specific timeline that I had committed to, that I need to make sure that I respond to, and therefore we went through that process. Yes, it was in my vision, it was that timeline.
So 2 questions in regard to that. What was that timeline? And within that timeline, you could not send an email to the Oversight Committee? You couldn't communicate with me or any of the Oversight Committee members?
It was 2 weeks, and we did some outreach. We did reach out to Leslie as part of the link to the Oversight Committee, and we reached out to a few other community members, and Carl can speak to some of those outreach components, but we did try to reach out. And 2 weeks, not a lot of time, unfortunately, and there's a lot of proposals that need to be looked at, and there were about 4, I believe, on this committee. We did attempt. It wasn't a very as thorough as it should have been.
Perhaps also that these deadlines are not externally generated, they're internally generated. And it might be helpful for you to know that, we're in the midst of defending our 2017 budget request. And the Housing Bureau's budget request was about a 50% increase over the prior year. So I had set an expectation that the funding decisions would be made before the council hearings were held on our budget, so that there was a sense of momentum and a sense of progress. So it was really, as much as anything, the larger budget process that drove our internal deadlines. Had we not been in a budget cycle, I think we would have been perhaps a little less driven to make a decision prior to council's budget hearings. But we wanted to obviously shine in that process and demonstrate that we were able to deploy this money quickly. That said, that led to a misstep in the selection process. The way that Commissioner Salzman and I operate is he gives people the good news and I give people the bad news, which means that 8 people heard from him and 14 people heard from me. Some people proffered more than one application, so it wasn't all 14 calls, it was about 10 calls. We had originally identified a company called Meta for the King Park site, and upon reconsideration, Commissioner Salzman decided that it would be a better long-term commitment to the community to identify PCRI for that site. So there was initial public notification put out about Meta, and within about 3 days, that decision was reversed. And as the decider, that in my estimation is fully within the commissioner's purview. But there was a decision made previously that identified Meta for that site, and that was by then, through mutual consent, redirected to PCRI.
Dr. Page.
I have a whole bunch of questions. So, first, just as a comment, I can't imagine an easier group of people to get a hold of to be part of external evaluation than the people who have already agreed to be on this committee, a number of whom have already participated in subcommittee proposal review, have participated in policy development outside of these meetings, but at other subcommittee meetings. You already have our emails. You know how to get in touch with us. There could not be a quicker set of people in a short time frame to get hold of and who have already demonstrated their capacity and willingness to put a lot of time toward this process. So I find that just very confusing. I'm not sure. I would love to know who the other evaluators, the external evaluators were, or what that process looked like. But I'm also just on a very baseline level thinking about what are we doing here when there is a NOFA, which at least parts of are geographically based, right? They're for ICURA TIF money. They're for sites that are in Northeast. this is the North and Northeast Neighborhood Housing Strategy Oversight Committee, how this body, not just individual people who would sit on a separate proposal review, but how this body is not a part of the timeline for reviewing projects. When we know that we want housing development and the concomitant community development pieces that go with that to fit into this housing strategy. So that's sort of a larger process question, which leads me to a number of more detailed questions about both the NOFA that went out and the scoring that came in around the Bureau's own racial equity lens, the anti-displacement / North-Northeast neighborhood strategy lenses that we would want to see scoring for, and sort of how those were put in the NOFA, the points that were awarded to those vis-a-vis other criteria, how they were rated, how they were understood by staff and external evaluators, particularly those who have not been part of this process, and sort of trying to figure out how we can do that piece better next time. Because I have to say, with total frankness, that those elements in the process for the previous homeownership funds allocation, which I participated in, Katrina participated in, and some other folks on this oversight committee, were very poorly developed, and the scoring and evaluation on those elements were not, in my estimation, considered appropriately when it came time to make decisions. They were not explicitly defined, they were not given sufficient point values, and there just was not a capacity to actually engage with those conversations when it came time to review proposals. So I have a tremendous concern about how that would have happened in any of these other parts of the NOFA. So maybe we can roll backwards to the process piece about how and why it is that there are funds being expended around the ICURA, TIF, LIFT, or otherwise that are not being looked at with the eyeballs of this committee.
So in terms of what we had established as a process, as I understand it, was that anything that the Bureau is proposing or moving forward in terms of funding is presented to the Oversight Committee for review. That the NOFA itself, and obviously this is something that can be modified, or I can correct if I'm mistaken in this in assumption, is that the NOFA itself or the selection process itself was not something that this body was a key part of, or a deciding part of. And that's how we structure the process.
So just to make sure I'm understanding, you're saying that the NOFA itself, the process, that the Oversight Committee does not weigh in on that? That's what you're understanding?
How we structured the process was in a way that the Oversight Committee was not a reviewer of the NOFA itself, so we did not, obviously didn't bring the NOFA to this body to say, review it and tell us what you think in terms of any type of analysis or scoring. And once we received proposals, that the Oversight Committee was not part of the deciding factor in selection of proposals within the interstate urban renewal area, that we would, once decisions were made, or as decisions are made, that they would be brought to this body to ensure that it's within the North-Northeast strategy that had been agreed upon. And so that's how we had structured this NOFA.
So if I understand what you're saying is that it was your understanding that whatever criteria, whatever process would determine what was the selection, whoever the recipients would be awarded, and then you would bring it to the Oversight Committee. Is that what I'm understanding?
Correct, with the clear idea that we would want Oversight Committee participants part of this or evaluation committees, so that there was that linkage. But as Lisa's saying, I did not perceive this body to be that that component or a key part of this selection process.
Go ahead, Dr. Davis.
Well,
Can I just add a couple facts? Hi, Carl Dinkelspiel. I'm the manager of the rental housing program at PHB. A couple facts. From just to back up from Director Krieger's accounting of how many proposals we received, we actually received 28 proposals altogether. Of those, we reviewed 26. And I was responsible for arranging all the committees and review process. I will say, from my perspective as the manager of that process, that there were, didn't bring the list with me, but there were between 30 and 40 people that I outreached to in order to staff the 3 committees that I thought we had. So from this committee, we included people that had more direct experience with what we were talking about. So we asked Lisa Faust, as well as Felicia Tripp, and we did have Jillian serve as a representative on the committee that we were, the initial 3 committees that we arranged. Jillian was the representative of this group for that committee. And as Javier explained, we had to unfortunately create a 4th committee sort of at the end of the process. We did not have representation from this committee on that last group.
I'm having like an existential question about what are we for? If not to be deeply engaged with funding decisions, selection process around achieving the goals of racial equity, which is a bureau-wide goal, not just for this committee, not just for this geographic area, but everywhere, of anti-displacement, of gentrification mitigation, something which this whole group of people has been working on, focused on, building capacity and expertise in. What are we for? Even if the decisions were brought here, if the decisions were already made and this wasn't going to be a body that said either yes, good decision, or not a very good decision, or let's rethink this decision, I'm just not clear what we're for. I mean, I don't mind coming to these meetings. I'm hearing good information. I can share it with other people. But what are we bringing to this process if we're not part of the process?
I'll give an opportunity for someone from PHB to respond to that. That was exactly the conversation I had with Commissioner Saltzman to clarify what we're for, because oversight is oversight. It's not advice, it's oversight. And this is the Oversight Committee. And so we talked about that. And therefore, our understanding is exactly what your understanding is not. That we do weigh in on the information and that someone from this Oversight Committee should be involved in the reviewing. I'm questioning which proposals were reviewed, which proposals did someone participate in that reviewed. That if we're talking about money spent in the interstate urban renewal area, the specific assignment within our charter is that we oversee that process, or that we're involved in that process.
So Bishop Holder, I do just want to emphasize the enormity of the NOFA itself and having to do all the arrangements, just to put it in context. So putting that aside, there were 10 proposals that we received in the interstate urban renewal area. 9 of them were reviewed by the committees, and all of those, so that would be both the internal and the external committees. Originally, the idea was to have the internal committee review all those 9 proposals as well as the external committee, because of various, as Javier has alluded to, various sort of scheduling issues. We had to break those 2 review bodies up. So what ended up happening was the initial interstate review process included Jillian, and we had asked, as I said, Lisa, Faust, and Felicia, both of whom couldn't make it. They reviewed 7 proposals, so there were the 4 proposals for the site that the county owns, and then 3 other proposals on the non-King Park site, if you will. So there was $1 million that was in the NOFA that was not reserved for any particular site. So that interstate committee reviewed those 7 proposals, and that Jillian served on that committee. And as I said, I asked several other folks from this group to be on that review panel. Because we ended up with a 4th review panel that we sort of scrambled to get together, there was nobody from this committee on that committee. And that group reviewed 2 proposals from Interstate. Those were both the ones that I think Kurt referred to. One proposal from Meta Housing and one proposal from PCRI for the King Park site. So those 2 proposals, in terms of this committee, did not have representation to see those 2 proposals. But from this committee, 7 of the proposals for Interstate were seen by not only Jillian, but 6 other committee members, including Kobe Lewis. So there were 5. I don't have the list of the committee members. I should have brought that with me. I'm sorry about that.
I just want to clarify that I am on this committee and I reviewed the NOFA proposals, but I was not approached to be the representation of this committee in that review process. That I was approached as someone who has experience in commercial real estate and also is involved with this committee to sit on that, but I am feeling very strongly right now that I am being put in a position where to wipe the slate clean, that it was not my understanding that my involvement in the NOFA process was the committee's involvement, and if I had understood that to be the case, I would have said something. I can speak to the process, and that as someone who's on this committee and was reviewing those proposals, I asked every single person that was presenting a proposal in the North-Northeast corridor what their preference policy was going to be for tenants. And I wanted to make sure that everyone that I rated as someone that I thought was a good proposal had a clear understanding of what that preference policy was supposed to be. But I don't think that equals this committee's review. I don't think that my participation is a substitute for everybody's input. And I just want to make that, I just wanted to state that because I didn't want to be get out of jail free card. So.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jillian. So I think that's the bigger question that's being asked is what's the role of this committee? And I don't mean to say that you were representative, that you were trying to represent all the folks here or making a decision for the committee, just simply that this committee was represented on the review panel. That's all.
Thank you.
And I would ask then for the committee that made the decision for the King Park site that didn't involve this committee or members from this committee, who was from the Northeast that was on that committee? Were there people of color that were on that committee?
So there were 4 members of that committee. That I do have those 4 members. So just to be clear again, there's an internal review panel and an external review panel. So I'm just speaking of the external review panel now. So the 4 members of that committee were Bill Hack, Rob Prash, Michelle Reeves, and Kaliska Day. The first 3 folks are European Americans, and the last, Kaliska, is Native American, and yes, there was nobody African American on that committee, as Javier's already explained.
I think perhaps more, I'm concerned about the people of color makeup, but I'm also very concerned about review by and criteria for the specific aspects of the North and Northeast strategy, right? So when we reviewed the homeownership proposal, which was a subcommittee of people that at least half of the people were on this committee, not one person who is in a vague role of I'm not sure what. I mean, I hear you're making like this distinction about a person from this committee versus a representative of this committee. I don't think I feel like that's a lot of hand waving. I would place no responsibility on Jillian to be the person who is supposed to conduit all of these proposal information back to this group. I mean, that's a structure that has to be put in place. When we reviewed the homeownership proposals with multiple people from this committee, that was grounded in criteria that said you need to speak to the issues that arose from this specific geography's history and community feedback, the priorities that were lifted up as the premise for this work. And so maybe someone who's not on this committee could look at those criteria if they've been paying attention. I think it would work a lot better if it were people who had been part of paying close attention this whole time to what those issues are and how they might be expressed in a proposal, you know, coming from some entity. But what is that in? And if not, why was that not part of the review process and the review criteria alongside of the racial equity lens in all of its dimensions? And how is that going to get rectified going forward?
The components of the North-Northeast housing strategy were a key part on the NOFA itself. And as Jillian mentioned, that even on the one that the fourth one that had the King Park site, that was one of the main conversation points within that committee in terms of the equity part and what the Bureau had done in terms of the work and the outreach for engagement, and the ensuring that the outcome is a key part of the North-Northeast strategy and in response to that engagement. We did not do any scoring on the NOFA itself, didn't have a score per se. It was more of evaluation in the proposals, and it was by design.
Okay.
That's what we had.
So I want to add a couple of pieces to that. One is that the proposals, I'm not sure how much you've had a chance to review those proposals, and I don't know if there's questions about those. I will say for certain that they all complied with the submittal requirements, which included a community development benefits plan, which addresses all the kinds of issues that you're talking about. So first, our sort of longstanding policy on MWESB, as well as outreach to the community. And if you look at actually who was awarded, you'll note a significant sort of inclusion with regard to the kinds of issues that you're talking about.
Having a plan and having a good plan are not the same thing.
Say again? I'm sorry.
Having a thing included and having it be good are not the same. So I'm really concerned both on the internal and external evaluation teams with the capacity to effectively evaluate a proposal's speaking to those criteria. And that is based on my experience doing proposal evaluation with this Bureau. I have real questions. How do you do that without scoring? How do you do that without a detailed rubric? How do you do that without a definition of what is an effective mechanism for including community benefits, community development goals, racial equity goals, and anti-displacement goals?
So I think that's a pretty complicated question, and I appreciate it. There's an aspect of that I think that the performance that we already have speaks to, and that we need to obviously do a better job in general. But the easiest thing to measure that we've been measuring consistently over the years has been MWESB participation, and we've had a relatively good outcomes, significantly higher than the 20% goal that we have as a city. The last time we have compiled it on an annual basis, we were at 30%. I would also note, and I think we'll talk about this later, is that all the proposals will be required to use the preference policy, which obviously hasn't been in place yet. It's not in place yet, but Grant Warehouse will be the first proposal that will try that out, and all these proposals will be subject to that and for the future. So part of the answer to your question is that the NOFA itself has criteria in it that require a number of performance to be measured. I'm not quite sure how to say that. and that those things have been measured by the Bureau and will continue to be measured by the Bureau.
And do those include speaking to the goals for the Northeast, for the interstate, speaking to the goals of the Northeast neighborhood housing strategy?
Right, exactly.
The DOFA for proposals Northeast required additional information regarding the outreach, regarding the components within the Northeast housing strategy, and in responses to that end. What I would also say is that for us, as Carl mentioned, on the multifamily development side, we have been dealing with the MWSB component for a while, so we feel very comfortable there. We are still learning from the outreach and tenant lease-up process as to the best practices. We've seen some scenarios where it has worked tremendously well with innovative housing and the site on Martin Luther King. We're learning from those processes, and we want to see, when we look at proposals and how they will do their outreach, is how innovative and how different and what kind of partnerships are they creating within the community. When we looked at the proposals specifically, let's talk about King Parks. Looking at Meta and the partnerships that Meta was bringing within their proposal, that it had a tremendous amount of community engagement. Same thing with PCRI. And so we look at those things, and we understand the impact that we want to make within these investments, as we have promised through the Northeast process. And that's in the forefront in those decisions, in those evaluations.
So let me just suggest that there is some steps in between understanding the impact that we want to make. The couple of things that you have that are very specific measurables, like MWESB. I think there's actually like a lot of other things around the impacts that you want to make that maybe aren't so easily, depicted in RFP. But there's like this whole middle ground that I feel concerned about when it's just we all know and then we have a holistic evaluation. And I say that coming from, from an education standpoint, right? When I evaluate students' work, I have to have given them a fairly detailed rubric of the expectations, right? Like conceptually and in a more detailed way about what does it mean when I say deliver this. And then I have to use that when I'm evaluating them, and I have to do that in a really systematic way, or else all the kinds of stuff that gets in the way, right? And I don't want to be distracted by the person who has a more beautifully formatted document, or the person that I think is like more fun in class. I want to be looking at the actual materials in a really systematic way. And that's hard to do. It's hard to grade things. It's hard to evaluate stuff, especially when you're using new concepts. And so I just want to really urge a rethink for both internal staff and training external evaluators into getting in the mindset and the habit of creating a conceptual to an operational to a measurable rubric that really gets used in a rigorous way around the issues of racial equity, affirmatively furthering fair housing, anti-displacement, because I just think that stuff, when it's left mushy, is very mushy.
So let me, that's a great point, and I want to ask you to respond to this maybe. So that the two proposals that we were challenged with for the King Parks site, for example, just on the development side, included, so the PCRI proposal was obviously PCRI was the sponsor, Colas Construction as the general contractor, Merriman Barnes was a certified women-owned business as the architect, and Cascade Property Management was that team. And the other team included Carlton Hart, O'Neill Construction, and Gina Woolley as a development consultant. So as we look at those proposals, at least on the face of them, we see that there's representation from the community, from the local community. So when we see that, that's an indication to us perhaps what you're saying is that that's not a sufficient indication, but that certainly is at least a good indication for us that we may be heading in the right direction.
Prior to Dr. Bates responding, let me add this. Part of the issue is, at least I'll speak for me, I never saw the proposals. We never saw them.
No, yeah.
And so how can we weigh in on whether or not it fits within criteria if we didn't see the proposals? That's what the issue was. That's what the problem was. It did not get before the Oversight Committee to give oversight. And then a determination was made, and I was made aware of a determination from a recipient. I never heard from PHB. That's problematic. And without understanding. I'm an email away.
So, there not being a score per se, there wasn't a clinical weight or grade attached to any of the received or rated proposals. When Meta and PCR went forward, they went forward with equal weight as two competing proposals with different characteristics. One, Meta happened to produce 76 units. PCR happened to produce 60 units. They both had, by all accounts, comparable community participation, comparable women and minority-owned business and disadvantaged business participation. So it was really a choice to be made. The Meta has some 55 completed projects, mostly in California. Their entry into the market increased the bandwidth of housing delivery in the city overall, which was seen as a good thing, versus PCRI, which had deep roots in the neighborhood and had a presence literally within 100 yards of the property in the form of their office. And I think the initial selection was based on increasing capacity because that was one of the directives that the Bureau has. And I think the choice that was made fell back to the community investment that PCRI had in the community. So they weren't clinically rated, they weren't scored in a manner that would allow you to say, here's a project that, because they are producing 16 more units, is superior. It wasn't that simple. They each had value, and frankly, the teams were very robust and fully capable of executing the project. I think that was the sort of the choice that the commissioner was faced with, and that's how it played out.
So to go back and respond to this question about sort of how do you tell which is best, is that you would have already developed a far more robust way of considering what it really means to do equity, to do anti-displacement, to do community benefits. Yeah, you're right. You can name people who are brown people and ladies. Great. What else matters? What else matters? And it's not to say that one would clearly come out on top of the other, or that there are not still hard decisions to be made and trade-offs and imbalances, but there is more than just check, check, check to be done. And I think it's about going deeper and creating a list, again, a rubric, a criteria, a set of criteria that tell us something more. And if it's about speaking to the specific needs, issues, values, and goals in North Northeast, I think there's a lot more that could be rated there than just, do you have a black person who builds stuff attached to your project? And I think some of that we saw in the previous homeownership RFP. We saw a conversation that said, these are the top 3 specific barriers that we know about because we have looked at this community, we have looked at the people, we have heard from the community, and this is how we're going to address those top 3 specific barriers. That's the kind of thing that I think you've got to go another level on if you really mean it about doing racial equity work, if you really mean it about doing a gentrification mitigation strategy, it's got to be thought through and fleshed out beyond these surface level metrics. It's still going to be hard. It's still not going to be always like clearly cut that this is good and this is not good. They might both be good, but there's probably some things that distinguish them when we get beyond the easy checkboxes that would help us at least have a conversation, which I would again urge would be this body having the conversation about what it means to do one project versus another project.
I would agree wholeheartedly with you. And I would just say that in this process, I would not say that it was a check mark that we just crossed because he had a specific person being a participant on that project. We did some analysis. There is a discussion about the community engagement and community involvement. But we can definitely do better. I think that, as you mentioned, we have, through the years in the NOFA, we have gone the whole gamut from being very, very specific in terms of scoring to being, this is where the most lax that we've gone in terms of evaluation. And if we are looking at having a specific rubric for equity, affirmative, fair housing, that we may need to go back to the drawing board and see what is it that looks like.
I just wanted to add, I think the frustration that you're hearing is the exclusion of this committee when that's not what this committee, we're not here, it's not a rubber stamp. And it would have been very easy. I understand that these proposals are confidential, and so discussing them openly at a meeting such as this would not be possible, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't discuss them somewhere else. I think, I understand that there was a time crunch. I think if everyone that's sitting here has expertise in equity and affordable housing and this neighborhood and could have brought something, I think, so much thought went into the homeownership scoring system, so much thought about how to reach people so that they know that there's this down payment assistance, where we heard about all the different locations that applications came from, that there were 60 slots and 1,000 applicants, but we don't know how that preference policy is going to be applied for these rental units because it wasn't, it's not specified and the committee didn't get to weigh in on that. And, what going forward, how do we make sure that we are part of that oversight, that we are part of that selection process as a body, not as an individual?
Well, let me speak to the conversation that Commissioner Saltzman and I had, and some of the things going forward, what that's going to look like, and to speak to Dr. Bates' question, what are we here for? That's exactly what we want to clarify so that we don't have this scenario again. So before I speak to that, let me say a couple of things. One is, and I think it's reflective even of the attendance tonight, and so I want to bring attention to it, that for the most impacted community of individuals who have been displaced and gentrified, there is a perspective that this is business as usual, that nothing is different, and that the effort to do something to assist them is disingenuous. And so communicating to individuals about even being present, the response has been repeatedly, what is the point? And why have you put yourself, me specifically, in such a precarious position? It doesn't make sense. We continue to have the same thing over and over and over and over again. So what I want you to understand is that this particular NOFA moment and the way the NOFA was handled communicates to a community that there is not genuine concern, effort, or decision to do things differently. So I want that to be in the context of your thinking. It is important that you understand that. So the thing that I talked to Commissioner Saltzman about was that if we're going to be an oversight committee, we should be included in all decisions related to dollars spent in the interstate corridor, the urban renewal area, that the oversight committee is engaged and involved, that we are first aware of, prior to even recipients being made aware, that we're first aware that there should be presence from members from this committee in those subcommittees. There should be presence from someone who understands that they are not simply there as an expertise to weigh in, but they are there representing the Oversight Committee and opportunity then to bring back that information to the Oversight Committee to have conversation in regard to that. And we are working at, and I don't know, Shannon, if you want to add anything to it, to clarify the charter to support and communicate such.
I'm Shannon Callahan. Oh, thank you. I'm Shannon Callahan, Commissioner Dan Salzman's Housing Policy Director. Thank you for having me join you this evening. Bishop Holt and Commissioner Salzman had a meeting, I think approximately 2 weeks ago. They have had prior meetings about the role of the committee and how the Housing Bureau, and in particular, quite frankly, our office, can help make communications, better, quite frankly, and this committee being more involved. I think it is an understatement to say that this process did not go well. And I think that part of this committee's role is to hold the Bureau's feet to the fire on the North and Northeast strategy, and that includes Commissioner Salzman as the commissioner in charge, and quite frankly myself as the primary Housing Bureau liaison from our office. So Bishop, I don't know if you want me to go into more detail. I mean, obviously you've stated the conversations between you and Commissioner Salzman. I know it may not feel like after this situation, I understand what you're saying, Bishop, about how it feels like business as usual, and I think that is very upsetting to us that we have once again perpetrated that in something that had all good intentions, and I think that these conversations that we're having tonight are extremely important, and I appreciate everyone's time and, quite frankly, candor and being honest with us about where we have not done a good job. And I believe that we intend to do everything in our power to do a better job. And I think we need to have clarity about just what Bishop was saying, how this committee is involved, how you are informed, and that we have a clear understanding of that, quite frankly, in writing. I think that's the simplest and best way to make sure that we're all on the same page. The North and Northeast Oversight Committee does have a charter, but I think it's very clear that, as Bishop has said, that we need to talk about this body being first informed of decisions. I think that it's clear from the Housing Bureau and the Housing Bureau Director that the involvement of the Oversight Committee on the individual members, or plural, singular or plural, on the funding decisions is something that needs to be committed to so that everybody has the same understandings. I don't know if you would like me to introduce a letter at this point, or if, does anyone have any questions for me? Obviously the commissioner had a role in these decisions. He is the decision maker, was the decision maker in this NOFA process, both on the initial decision regarding King Parks and then in the secondary decision. So, I'd be happy to answer questions you may have on behalf of him and our office, if there's anything that anyone would like to ask. Okay. So this may seem, this is actually a letter from Kurt, Director Krieger, and Commissioner Salzman. And in some ways, I feel a little awkward delivering this letter to all of you tonight, because in this is a request to actually expand this committee's role. And as we're talking about maybe not having done a great job with this committee, I think it, I just have to say it feels awkward for us to say, hey, but we'd like you to do more. Yeah. But we would, and the commissioner and Director Krieger would actually like your help and continuing to expand beyond the initial $20 million commitment that came out of the North and Northeast property a year ago. Officially, that is this committee's charter role. Bishop, would you?
I agree, yes.
Okay. So I believe that Bishop has had communications with the commissioner and I think the Bureau for quite some time on the expanded TIF lift funds that came out of the council's action approximately 6 months ago to increase the amount of TIF funds citywide, which actually increases the amount of TIF, tax increment financing funds in the urban renewal area in interstate to about $32 million over the next 15 years. And we would like this committee, the commissioner and Kurt would like this committee to help us both plan for the use of those funds and then secondarily have an oversight role for those funds. There, in the letter you can see it's a respectful request. I don't think anyone has to answer that request tonight. I can understand why there may be some hesitation, but we also wanted to share what the official request is. I think going forward that, quite frankly, I find that more things are clear in writing as opposed to verbal, and I think we need to start memorializing agreements that the Bureau and the Commissioner's Office make in writing so that there are understandings that we may have, our office may have with the committee or the chair, Bishop Holt, and so that information is consistent and in one place and memorialized. So I appreciate you letting me take the time to talk with you.
And we do have a new charter that is being, or an addition or an addendum to the charter that is being worked on. Do we have any time frame or any idea?
I haven't started it because the request letter, I assumed that we would want to incorporate this. I believe Leslie and I will be talking about, sorry, Leslie, did you want to?
Oh, no, I was just saying that we wanted to present the letter first before we made any changes to the charter to make sure that the committee was okay with the expansion before we added in the new language.
And that new language would specify some of the things I alluded to from,
Yes.
So that we're very clear on what the role of the Oversight Committee is, so that all parties, PHB and us, are on the same page and moving in the same direction.
Yes, and and I'll be honest. I mean, I think sometimes that Bishop, you may have a communication with the commissioner and or even myself, and we may not have even done the best job communicating that back to our bureau partners. So I would love to say that we are streamlined in all of our communications, but sometimes we make missteps, and so I think that this will help all of us make sure that we're on the same page as to what this committee's role is, how we intend to interact with this committee, what expectations you can have from us going forward. So,
I appreciate that. Any questions from Oversight Committee meetings from members? Any comments?
I have a question around the charter expansion. Do you have an idea of what that looks like?
I think that I think this letter. I think that that's what we're talking about in terms of the expansion. It's an expansion of the role of the committee in terms of both helping us plan for and oversight of the TIF lift funds, and quite frankly, it would essentially uncover the entire URAC. Right now, this committee is technically only charged with the $20 million North and Northeast Oversight Strategy Plan. So that the role is very specific to those funds, and the role is one of oversight. I think in terms of what Bishop and the Commissioner have talked about is ensuring that what he said just a moment ago, what Bishop said a moment ago, is ensuring that this committee is notified first of decision-making prior to public announcement, of ensuring that one or more members of this committee serve and identified as such. I think, Jillian, you make a really good point, knowing that that you are representing in some ways that committee on that panel. And so those are the things that I know that the commissioner and Bishop have committed to putting in writing and memorializing. I can't, I don't have an idea of anything beyond that.
Any other comments from committee member?
I think it's pretty clear that whatever the expansion of our charter is, has to include some pretty specific language as to the teeth of this committee. That, none of us, we're all very busy people, and none of us are here to waste our time. And I'm not here to hear myself talk and, be on TV. So I want assurances, and I think that we all do, that this means something, that there is, I don't want a decision to be brought to this committee. I want this committee to make decisions.
Well, I think that that is a tremendous expansion of this committee's role in a way that I don't know that this committee can ultimately make decisions. The Bureau right now and the director have technically made funding reservations. The ultimate decision for all funding rests with City Council. And so, I think how we have this committee be involved in that process is an important thing to talk about, but I think we also have to consider conflicts of interest potentially on this committee with any proposals that folks may have coming forward. I can't speak as to what that is, but this committee was not, whether rightly or wrongly, was not put together as a funding decision panel. And I think that having this committee and individual members involved in those decisions is something that we've discussed and needs to be clarified, but it was not intended nor created to be a funding decision-making body.
And maybe decision-making is too strong a term for a body that's not elected, but recommendations, really, what, I understand that ultimately the decision-making power is with our elected officials, and I'm not going to I'm not going to say that that's incorrect, but those recommendations on what those decisions should be should come to this committee. I don't want to hear. I don't think that anyone on this committee wants to have a decision be made and then we're told about it. We want to inform that decision.
Well, and I think that there are different ways then we can talk about how this committee would inform a potential decision. Whether that is helping us put together I shouldn't say us, I am not the Housing Bureau, helping put together the materials that go forward to making those decisions, helping construct and looking at getting a deeper dive into how those decisions are made. I think you have had a little snippet of that. But I just want to be frank that having this body being the funding decision maker is not something that that we've discussed, and I think that Bishop and Commissioner Salzman have been clear on that since before the committee was founded. So I want to be frank about that, and I don't want to lead anybody to a misconception.
Legally beyond our purview
Yeah.
to be a decision-making body. However, weighing in and being engaged in the process is something we did agree upon, and how we do that, we need to articulate.
And I
be
think
very clear. So-
how to make sure that that folks feel like they're informed through the process and involved, I think is going to be key to that. And I can't even speak to exactly what I don't necessarily have suggestions. I think those suggestions need to be worked on between the Housing Bureau and this body.
Well, thank you. Is there any other comment I want to make sure that I hear from the Oversight okay, Kurt, Director Krieger.
So, I think we agree the process can be improved upon, but I would like to summarize the outcome, because while the process may have been flawed, I think the actual results are satisfactory. I did a written response to Bishop Holt's request about a discernment about how much money from the $20 million has been allocated into what purpose, how much money from TIF in the base versus the so-called TIF lift have been allocated. And that's public information, and be happy to provide it to you in writing. But just to summarize, Grant Warehouse, PCRI, received a total of $7 million. Of that, 4.5 million came from the $20 million that the mayor set aside, and 2.5 million was allocated from the TIF lift. That was the increased amount of tax increment that was granted to the Bureau last November. So those two sums together total 7 million, and they are producing 80 units for that $7 million. PCRI also received site control of the King Park site. They initially, upon our request, applied for, conceived an application for 4% tax credits. That will be a 9% tax credit project. Their total commitment is 4.5 million. Of that, 3.5 comes out of the 20 million, and 1 million came from the TIF base, something that we would have had under the old 30% rubric. Bridge Housing received site control of the county-owned site next to Albertina Kerr at North Williams, plus $4.5 million. And of that, 4.2 million was the base, nothing from the 20 million, but some $300,000 from the TIF lift. The North Interstate site adjoining the Alberta Head Start was proposed and won by Central City Concern. They're getting $1 million in TIF, and they're also receiving $1.2 million in general fund revenues from Multnomah County for $2.2 million in total. They would produce 51 units. And I think I omitted to say that Bridge Housing is producing 61 units for the 4.5 million. So all those multifamily units taken together constitutes 252 units. Now, you need to know that in real estate, numbers change, and I want to give you a heads up that the Alberta Head Start is out of space, and they have been working in collaboration as good neighbors with Central City Concern. They would like some space within the new building for classrooms. That will take probably 2 units out of service. So even though we allocated for 252, it'll likely be 250 units because of that accommodation, which we think is appropriate. So writ large, we have allocated 9 million, the multifamily money. The home ownership money you've received reports on previously, but a total of $12.6 million has been allocated for home ownership. Of that, 9 million out of the 20 million mayoral set aside, and 3.6 million from the base. And of the land banking sum, 3 million was dedicated. We have entered into escrow for $2 million for the site at 5020 North Interstate, which is at the corner of Alberta and Interstate, between Alberta and Webster. It is a half a block of property currently with a convenience store and a glass store, retail glass, not glass manufacturing, since that seems to be a problem in Portland. And that is in escrow and is due to close for $2 million. So of the land banking money, we've allocated $2 million with $1 million remaining. Of the home ownership, we've allocated $12.6 million. And that means that of the 20 million, we essentially have 1 million remaining for land banking, but everything else is allocated. And it is time to be thinking, as Shannon Callahan has described to you, about your charter beyond the 20 million, which would include the $32 million of identified new TIF dollars. I do want to bring to your attention a site that will be in the public domain in June. I've prepared copies of materials. I'm going to send 2 copies to my right and everything else to my left of this. It's in Kenton. And the reason I need you to know about this is exactly what we were just talking about, which is what is the purpose of this committee anyway. As Shannon works with Leslie on a new charter, the TriMet has made public their intentions to select a developer through a request for qualifications. The first sheet that I give you is a excerpt from about a 58-page document prepared by OTAC. And for disclosure, I used to work for OTAC, although I had nothing to do with this particular project. OTAC was retained by TriMet to evaluate the property, which is at Argyle Street and Interstate Avenue. This was the staging area for the light rail construction, and they developed a series of alternative analyses that could produce about 250 units of housing on the site. The graphic that shows sites numbers, the site in question is site number 1. Site number 3 is owned by PDC, and site number 2 is owned by PDC, although 2 has a long-term lease for a manufacturing company. So TriMet is requesting statements of qualifications from developers on June 22nd. And since you don't have a meeting in June, I wanted to make sure that you were aware of this, because all the developers are interested in knowing what the city will bring to bear on this project to help make it affordable. TriMet has only asked for a minimum of 25% of the project to be affordable, and some developers are looking at providing more, which we encourage. How much more depends in part on how much equity is available from the city. So if your charter is indeed expanded to include something other than the $20 million, then we'll need to deal with this in July. We'll have to be talking about it, because TriMet will either select one preferred developer and go into a negotiated bid, or if they feel it necessary, they could select more than one developer and ask for specific proposals. So this is an opportunity of pretty great significance given the interstate corridor, because we know how much land is available for sale, not much, at affordable prices, hardly any, since we've been in that marketplace now for ever since you set aside the land banking money. So the other diagram is straight from the Argyle solicitation. It shows the parcelization of properties and the arrangement of the site. So I wanted you to be aware of that, because we'll need to design a process by which we assist TriMet to take their request for qualifications to specific realistic proposals. This ultimately, to the extent that any TIF dollars are involved, as Shannon mentioned, Commissioner Salzman has to own the process, but your involvement could be quite instrumental in its success. And I think embedded in Shannon's letter is that as your scope expands, so too your members would likely expand to include Kenton and possibly St. John's, since those are areas of interest as well. So I wanted to make sure that you're aware of this, because it'll become public after the due date of June 22nd.
Thank you, Director. I would ask, and let me say to my committee members, thank you so much for the time that you have invested in this process. Thank you for your willingness to continue to work on this issue. It is significant. It is extremely important. And your voice, your thoughts, your insights are highly valued. I would ask that in regard to the letter around expanding our role, if you would look it over, and then let's interact. I think we can interact via email in regard to thoughts, questions, suggestions related to that particular letter. And then we can make determinations as to how to best respond in regard to that. And I think we can do that within a week. I would presume we could do that within a couple of days, actually. But want to make sure that we're expeditious on our part to respond appropriately. Thanks to everyone who came tonight. Thank you for your time and your willingness to sit through a process that is, to some degree, new. This is the first Oversight Committee that I'm aware of in the history of the city. And so part of being new means you run into glitches, means you run into issues. And I'm the kind of individual who works through the issues, at least puts forth the effort and the energy to work through the issues and to get to a point that we can resolve. So I thank you for participating in the process and hearing. We did not have anyone who signed up to speak at the mic, which is why I didn't have anyone called to do so. But there are ways for your voice to be heard. You can email the Portland Housing Bureau. You can communicate, and you will be responded to. You can contact me, and I will respond to you. Or there are staff members from the Portland Housing Bureau. Ted Salter, you see your finger up. Mm-hmm. You want to come to the mic real quickly? Yep. And I've got about 2 minutes. Mm-hmm.
My name is Ted Salter, and I am the homeownership coordinator for PCRI. And one of the reasons why I haven't come to any of these meetings is because usually on Thursday nights we are facilitating classes for people who are desperately wanting homeownership. I'm appalled at the level of dysfunction I heard here tonight. And I understand and I just heard what you just said, but you have to understand, people are hurting out here. They're expecting this to work. They trust you. They have a lot of trust in this process. As you were talking about this committee, it's brought hope to people in this community. And we see it every day. When people come into our offices and they've heard that there's an oversight committee that is working as a partner with Portland Housing Bureau, it's brought a lot of hope to people. So I'm a little disappointed in my first time coming out tonight and seeing this dysfunction. So I would hope moving forward that all of you would recognize that as you said earlier, Dr. Bates, what is the function? What is it for? What does success look like moving forward? Because it's important that you're able to tell this community what success is going to look like for the future of Portland. I've heard in the past 6 months about the capacity of PCRI, but understand what people who have, for the last 24 years, have lived in that housing that they've provided. If not for PCRI, all that housing, 1,000 families would have been gentrified. They'd be gone. And guess what? They know it. They know they'd be gone. So the confidence in PCRI is high. And I'm hoping moving forward that others, whether it be Bridge or other housing companies, community development companies, would want to build in that price point so that we can have more affordable housing in our community. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Appreciate you, Director Krieger, for being here tonight. Javier and Carl, thank you. Thank you very much, Shannon, for coming and helping to work through this process. And again, thanks, community members, for being here. We are committed, at least I am, to doing what's necessary to make this work. It matters. Have a good night.